The arrow flew through the air with deadly precision, finding its mark in the center of the target with a satisfying thud that echoed across the suddenly silent archery range. Every head turned toward Lane 7, where Madison Rivers stood frozen, her bow still raised, hardly believing what had just happened. "Impossible," whispered Jake Morrison, the range's top instructor, his clipboard clattering to the concrete floor. "That was a perfect bullseye from 70 meters." The Riverside Community Center's annual charity tournament had been underway for 3 hours, with dozens of experienced archers competing for the grand prize. Local celebrities, retired Olympic hopefuls, and weekend warriors had all taken their shots, each missing the mark by increasingly frustrating margins. The target, positioned at an intimidating distance that separated amateurs from professionals, had remained untouched by perfection. Until now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison lowered her bow slowly, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of what she'd accomplished began to sink in. Around her, a crowd of onlookers pressed closer, their faces displaying mixtures of shock, admiration, and disbelief. These were the same people who saw her 6 days a week behind the checkout counter at Grandview Grocery, scanning their items with quiet efficiency, barely acknowledging their existence beyond polite pleasantries. "Madison," called out Rebecca Chen, a regular customer who typically treated her like part of the store fixtures. "Madison from the grocery store? How did you—" The question hung in the air, unfinished but loaded with implications that would change everything Madison had carefully constructed about her public identity. 3 hours earlier, Madison had been standing in her usual position at Register 4, enduring the typical Tuesday afternoon rush of impatient shoppers and demanding customers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glare on the endless stream of products she mechanically scanned. Cereal boxes, frozen dinners, cleaning supplies, the mundane necessities of suburban life. "Paper or plastic?" she'd asked Mrs. Ross Patterson, the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday at exactly 2:30, always buying the same items, always paying with exact change counted out slowly from a worn leather purse. "Paper, dear," Mrs. Patterson had replied, as she always did, barely glancing at Madison's face. "And could you double-bag the milk? Last time the boy didn't do it properly." Madison had nodded silently, the way she always did, carefully placing the gallon of skim milk in a reinforced paper bag. She'd learned long ago that most customers saw her as an extension of the machinery, a human component of the checkout process, rather than an individual with thoughts, dreams, or capabilities beyond basic retail functions. The grocery store uniform didn't help. The ill-fitting green polo shirt with Grandview Grocery embroidered across the chest pocket, the black slacks that had seen better days, the name tag that simply read Madison in plain block letters. Everything about her appearance was designed to blend into the background, to become invisible in the way that service workers often do, in a society that values them just enough to rely on their labor but not enough to see them as fully realized human beings. "Still working here, honey?" Mrs. Patterson had asked, counting out her change with deliberate slowness. "When are you going to find something better? A smart girl like you shouldn't be stuck in a place like this." The comment stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was delivered with such casual dismissiveness. Mrs. Patterson meant well, in her way, but her words carried the assumption that Madison's current position represented the limit of her potential, that grocery store cashier was both her present reality and her inevitable future. Madison had smiled politely, the expression she'd perfected over 2 years of similar interactions. "Thank you for shopping with us today, Mrs. Patterson. Have a wonderful afternoon." But as the elderly woman shuffled away with her carefully bagged groceries, Madison's hand had unconsciously moved to her back pocket, where she kept a small piece of paper folded into a tight square. The paper contained information that Mrs. Patterson would never expect, credentials that seemed impossible for someone standing behind a grocery store checkout counter. The tournament flyer had been posted on the community center bulletin board for 3 weeks, calling for participants in the annual charity archery competition. Madison had walked past it dozens of times on her way to catch the bus after work, each time feeling a familiar pull, a recognition of something that called to parts of herself she'd buried beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. She'd finally torn off one of the entry forms on a Friday evening when the rain was coming down hard and the bus was running late. Standing there under the flickering streetlight, water dripping from the bulletin board's protective plastic cover, she'd made a decision that would unravel everything she'd spent 2 years building. The entry form had asked for basic information: name, age, experience level. Madison had filled in the first two truthfully, but had hesitated over the third. Experience level: beginner, intermediate, advanced, professional. Her pen had hovered over the options for several minutes before she'd checked beginner, though that designation represented perhaps the greatest lie she'd ever told about herself. Now, standing in the sudden spotlight of unexpected excellence, Madison realized that lies have a way of exposing themselves at the most inconvenient moments. The perfect bullseye wasn't just a lucky shot. It was a revelation that threatened to tear down the carefully constructed barriers between who she appeared to be and who she actually was. Jake Morrison approached cautiously, his expression cycling between professional skepticism and genuine amazement. As the range's head instructor, he'd seen thousands of archers over his 15-year career, from complete novices who could barely hold a bow properly to seasoned competitors who could split arrows at competition distances. He knew the difference between luck and skill, between accident and precision. "That was incredible," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect typically reserved for accomplished athletes. "Where did you train?" "I don't recognize your technique, but that form was absolutely perfect." Madison's throat felt dry, and she realized that dozens of eyes were still fixed on her, waiting for an explanation that she wasn't prepared to give. The story she'd rehearsed in her head, about picking up archery as a hobby, about practicing at a range in another town, suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. I've been practicing," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Practicing where?" Jake pressed, his instructor's instincts clearly sensing that there was more to this story than a casual hobbyist's lucky shot. "That level of precision doesn't happen overnight. That's years of training, maybe decades." The crowd around them had grown larger, including several people Madison recognized from the grocery store. Tom Bradley, who bought energy drinks and complained about prices every Thursday morning. Sarah Lopez, who always tried to use expired coupons and argued when they were declined. Kevin Walsh, the manager from the hardware store next door, who'd never so much as nodded when they passed on the sidewalk. All of them were looking at her with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the quiet cashier they thought they knew with the woman who had just demonstrated a level of skill that suggested depths they'd never imagined. "Madison," said a familiar voice from the back of the crowd. She turned to see David Chen, Rebecca's teenage son, pushing forward with his phone held high. "That was amazing! Can you do it again? I'm recording this for TikTok." The request sent a chill down Madison's spine. Social media exposure was the last thing she needed. The one outcome that could unravel not just her carefully maintained low profile, but potentially put her in genuine danger. There were people, organizations who might be very interested to learn where Madison Rivers had ended up, and what skills she was still capable of demonstrating. "Please don't," she said quickly, her hand instinctively reaching out toward the phone. "I'd rather you didn't record this." David looked confused, his teenage mind unable to process why anyone wouldn't want their moment of triumph documented and shared with the world. "But this is incredible!" "You're like famous now. Everyone's going to want to see this." Famous. The word hit Madison like a physical blow. Fame was the opposite of everything she'd been working toward for the past 2 years. Fame meant attention, investigation, questions that she couldn't answer without revealing truths that were supposed to stay buried forever. Jake Morrison was still studying her with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Your stance," he said slowly, "it's not civilian training. That's military precision. Where did you serve?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Madison felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with getting too close to conversations she couldn't have. Military service was part of her story, but only a small part, and certainly not the part that explained how she could place an arrow in the exact center of a target from 70 meters away without even seeming to aim. "I wasn't military," she said, which was technically true, though it omitted several crucial details about the nature of her government service. "Then where?" Jake pressed, his curiosity clearly overriding any sense of social boundaries. "Because I've worked with Olympic-level archers, and that shot wasn't just good. That was world-class. That was the kind of precision that takes a lifetime to develop." Madison realized that she was trapped in a web of her own making. Every answer she gave would lead to more questions. each one pulling her further away from the safe anonymity she'd cultivated. But silence would be just as damaging, creating speculation and rumors that might draw even more unwanted attention. The truth was impossible to tell, not just because it was classified at levels that most people didn't know existed, but because it would fundamentally change how everyone in this room saw her. The quiet cashier who scanned their groceries would disappear forever, replaced by someone whose very existence challenged their assumptions about who belonged in positions of service and who deserved respect. More than that, revealing the truth would mean acknowledging skills that she'd tried desperately to leave behind, abilities that came with memories she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The perfect bullseye wasn't just a demonstration of marksmanship. It was a glimpse into a past that included training most people couldn't imagine, missions that officially never happened, and a level of precision with weapons that extended far beyond sporting bows and target practice. "I should go," Madison said quietly, beginning to back away from the crowd. This was a mistake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Jake Morrison stepped into her path, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching concern. "Wait," he said. "I don't know what your story is, but talent like that doesn't just disappear because you're uncomfortable. The tournament's not over. There's a $1,000 prize for the winner, plus a scholarship opportunity for advanced training." The money would have been welcome. Madison's grocery store salary barely covered her modest apartment and basic expenses, leaving nothing for the luxuries that most people took for granted. $1,000 represented more than a month's wages, enough to provide some financial breathing room in a life that had been carefully constructed around economic limitations. But the scholarship opportunity was what truly caught her attention, and also what terrified her most. Advanced training would mean background checks, references, documentation of previous experience. It would mean questions she couldn't answer honestly, forms she couldn't fill out completely, scrutiny that would inevitably lead to discoveries she couldn't afford. "I appreciate the offer," Madison said, "but I really can't." "Can't or won't?" Jake asked, and something in his tone suggested that he understood more about her reluctance than she was comfortable with. "Look, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know the difference between someone who's hiding their skill level and someone who's hiding their identity. Which one are you?" The question was too close to the truth for comfort, and Madison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potential exposure. It was the same feeling she'd experienced in situations far more dangerous than a community center archery range, but the physiological response was identical. Heightened awareness, increased heart rate, the involuntary preparation for fight or flight. "Neither," she lied, knowing that her body language was probably contradicting her words. "I just got lucky." Jake's expression suggested that he didn't believe her for a second, but before he could respond, a commotion near the registration table drew everyone's attention. A man in an expensive suit was arguing with the tournament organizers, his voice carrying across the range with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "What do you mean there's a problem with my registration?" he demanded. "I've been competing in these tournaments for 5 years. My company sponsors this event." Madison recognized him immediately. Richard Steinberg, CEO of Steinberg Development, the company responsible for half the new construction in Riverside. He was also one of her least favorite customers at the grocery store, the type who treated service workers like they were barely human and expected special treatment based on his perceived importance. "Sir," the tournament organizer was saying, "we've had some concerns raised about your equipment. There are regulations about bow modifications that we need to verify." "Regulations?" Steinberg's voice rose another octave. "I'll have you know that this bow costs more than most people make in a month. Everything about it is perfectly legal." Madison watched the drama unfold, grateful for the distraction that drew attention away from her own situation. But her relief was short-lived when she noticed Jake Morrison continuing to study her, his gaze moving between her face and her hands, clearly analyzing details that most people would miss. "Your calluses," he said quietly, leaning closer so that only she could hear. "They're not consistent with recreational archery. They're consistent with daily practice, professional-level training. And your grip on the bow wasn't instinctive. It was trained to the point of muscle memory. That doesn't happen at weekend ranges." Madison realized that she'd underestimated Jake Morrison. His 15 years of experience had taught him to read more than just technique. He could read the signs that separated amateurs from professionals, hobbyists from experts, and people who were exactly what they seemed from people who were hiding in plain sight. "You're wrong," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Maybe," Jake replied, "but that arrow didn't lie, and neither did your form. Whatever your story is, Madison Rivers, it's a lot more interesting than grocery store cashier who picked up archery as a hobby." The use of her full name sent another chill down Madison's spine. She hadn't provided her last name when she'd signed up for the tournament, listing herself simply as Madison on the entry form. The fact that Jake knew her surname meant he'd done some checking, possibly even some research, which was exactly the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid. The fluorescent lights of Grandview Grocery cast their familiar harsh glow as Madison clocked in for her Wednesday morning shift, exactly 18 hours after her world had shifted at the community center. Her hands moved through the routine motions of preparation, adjusting her name tag, checking her register drawer, arranging the plastic bags with mechanical precision. But everything felt different now, as if the perfect bullseye had cracked something fundamental in the carefully constructed walls between her public and private selves. Store manager Patricia Wolf emerged from the office with her usual clipboard and disapproving expression, surveying the morning staff with the critical eye of someone who'd spent 30 years in retail management. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn every day for the past 2 years, and her reading glasses hung from a chain that had seen better decades. "Rivers," she called out, her voice carrying across the store with practiced authority. "You're on register 4 today. And remember, we've got corporate coming through this afternoon, so I want everything to be perfect. No slow scanning, no chatting with customers, and definitely no personal phone calls." Madison nodded silently, though she rarely spoke to customers beyond basic pleasantries and had never made a personal phone call during work hours. Her phone, a basic model she'd purchased with cash 2 years ago, contained exactly 7 contacts: her landlord, the grocery store, the pizza place that delivered to her apartment, the local library, the bus company's customer service line, her doctor's office, and one number she'd never called but couldn't bring herself to delete. The morning rush began with its usual parade of commuters grabbing coffee and breakfast items before heading to jobs that probably paid 3 times what Madison earned. She recognized most of them by now. The insurance salesman who always bought the same energy bar and black coffee. The real estate agent who complained about everything being too expensive while wearing shoes that cost more than Madison's monthly rent. The bank manager who treated her like she was intellectually deficient. "Paper or plastic?" Madison asked automatically as she scanned items for Carol Brennan, a woman who worked at the city planning office and had never once made eye contact during their countless transactions. "Plastic," Carol replied without looking up from her phone, where she was typing furiously. "And make it quick. I'm late for a meeting." Madison bagged the items efficiently, her movements economical and precise in ways that most customers never notice. But precision was something she couldn't turn off, a habit ingrained through training that had nothing to do with retail work, and everything to do with situations where attention to detail meant the difference between success and failure, between life and death. As Carol hurried away without a word of thanks, Madison caught sight of her reflection in the security monitor mounted above the register. The image showed exactly what everyone expected to see. A 28-year-old woman in an ill-fitting uniform, anonymous and unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the background of daily commerce. What the reflection couldn't show was the deliberate nature of that anonymity. Every aspect of Madison's appearance had been carefully calculated to avoid drawing attention. Her brown hair was kept in a simple ponytail, never styled in ways that might be memorable. She wore no jewelry except for a plain watch, no makeup beyond basic lip balm, no accessories that might catch the eye or spark conversation. The uniform helped, of course. The green polo shirt was intentionally purchased one size too large, obscuring the athletic build that years of intensive physical training had developed. The black slacks were similarly loose-fitting, chosen to hide the muscle definition that might raise questions about her fitness level. Even her posture was consciously adjusted, shoulders slightly rounded, stance casual, rather than the military straight-bearing that felt more natural. "Next," Madison called softly, not wanting to draw Patricia's attention with excessive volume. The next customer was someone she'd never seen before, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested outdoor activities rather than office work. She placed her items on the conveyor belt with unusual care, arranging them in a way that seemed almost ritualistic. Trail mix, energy bars, bottled water, first aid supplies, topographical maps of the local mountain ranges. The purchases painted a picture of someone who spent serious time in wilderness areas, possibly hiking or camping, but the precision with which she'd selected each item suggested something more purposeful than recreational outdoor activities. "Beautiful day for hiking," Madison offered, making conversation despite her usual preference for silence. The woman looked up sharply, her eyes focusing on Madison's face with sudden intensity. "You hike?" she asked, her tone carrying unexpected interest. "Sometimes," Madison replied, which was technically true, though her hiking experience had involved terrain far more challenging than the gentle trails around Riverside. "The eastern trails are opening up next week after the winter closures," the woman said, studying Madison's face as if trying to read something beyond her words. "Great views from Eagles Peak if you can handle the elevation gain." Madison nodded, though she was familiar with Eagles Peak from aerial reconnaissance photos rather than ground-level hiking experiences. The mountain had been part of her operational territory during a period of her life that officially never existed, when she'd spent weeks at a time in wilderness areas that weren't marked on any civilian maps. "I'm Sarah Blackwood," the woman said, extending her hand across the counter. "I run outdoor education programs for at-risk youth, always looking for people with real wilderness experience to help with the more advanced groups." The handshake was firm, professional, and Madison noticed that Sarah's calluses were consistent with regular rope work and rock climbing. She also noticed the way Sarah's eyes briefly assessed her hands, probably making similar calculations about Madison's background and experience level. "Madison," she replied, deliberately omitting her last name. "That sounds like important work." "It is," Sarah agreed. "These kids need mentors who understand that confidence comes from competence, that real self-esteem is built through actual achievement rather than empty praise. Too many programs focus on making participants feel good without teaching them skills that might actually change their lives." The philosophy resonated with Madison in ways that surprised her. Her own training had been built on exactly that principle. Competence earned through relentless practice. Confidence developed through demonstrated ability under increasingly challenging conditions. The idea of passing those lessons on to young people who needed direction and purpose appealed to parts of herself she'd tried to suppress. "That makes sense," Madison said carefully. "I'm always looking for volunteers with specialized skills," Sarah continued, her tone suggesting that she detected something in Madison that most people missed. "Archery, marksmanship, wilderness survival, tactical planning, skills that teach discipline and focus." The list sent alarm bells ringing in Madison's mind. Sarah Blackwood wasn't making casual conversation. She was probing, testing, looking for reactions that might confirm suspicions about Madison's background. The question was whether those suspicions were based on observation, research, or something more concerning. "I don't have specialized skills," Madison lied, keeping her expression neutral, "just basic retail experience." Sarah's smile suggested she didn't believe that for a second. "Of course," she said. "Well, if you ever want to learn, we're always teaching new people. Sometimes the most surprising individuals turn out to have natural aptitude for things they never thought they could do." She paid for her items with cash, exact change, and left without another word. But Madison noticed that she'd left one of the topographical maps on the counter, apparently by accident. When Madison picked it up to call after her, she realized that the map wasn't blank. Someone had marked specific locations with small symbols that looked like tactical notations rather than hiking waypoints. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Madison found herself thinking about Sarah Blackwood's visit, wondering if it had been coincidence or something more purposeful. The timing, coming so soon after her exposure at the archery tournament, seemed suspicious. In her previous life, she'd learned that coincidences were usually anything but coincidental. During her lunch break, Madison walked to the small park behind the grocery store where she usually ate her sandwich in solitude while reading library books. Today, however, she found the park occupied by a group of teenage boys who were clearly cutting school and equally clearly looking for trouble. "Hey, grocery girl," called out the largest of the group, a kid who couldn't have been more than 16 but carried himself with the swagger of someone trying to project adult menace. "You got any money on you?" Madison assessed the situation automatically, noting escape routes, potential weapons, the positioning of the other boys who were clearly meant to intimidate through numbers rather than individual capability. Her training kicked in before she could suppress it, cataloging threats and calculating responses with the efficiency of someone who'd faced far more dangerous situations. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly, which was true. Trouble would mean police reports, questions about her identity, possibly even background checks that might reveal information she couldn't afford to have discovered. "Neither do we," the boy replied, stepping closer with his friends flanking him in a formation that suggested they'd done this before. "We just want to borrow some cash. A loan between neighbors." Madison realized that she was trapped between revealing skills she needed to keep hidden and allowing herself to become a victim of teenage extortion. Either choice carried risks, but one was immediate and manageable while the other was permanent and potentially catastrophic. "I only have a few dollars," she said, reaching slowly into her purse. What happened next would have been invisible to most observers, but to someone with Madison's training, the boy's movement was telegraphed well in advance. He lunged forward, intending to grab her purse, but found himself flat on his back on the grass before he understood what had happened. Madison stood over him, her expression unchanged, her breathing completely normal. The other boys stared in shock, unable to process how their intimidating friend had ended up on the ground without any visible effort from the quiet grocery store cashier. "Are you okay?" Madison asked, extending her hand to help the boy up. "You slipped on the wet grass." The boy looked confused, glancing between Madison's offered hand and his friends' bewildered faces. He accepted her help getting to his feet, his earlier swagger completely deflated. "Yeah," he mumbled, "slipped on the grass." "You should be more careful," Madison said gently. "These old parks can be dangerous if you're not watching where you step." The group left without another word, probably to spend the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out what had actually happened. Madison finished her lunch in peace, but she knew that the incident represented another crack in her carefully maintained facade. Skills like hers didn't develop through casual self-defense classes or weekend workshops. They required the kind of intensive training that came with backgrounds that were supposed to remain buried. The afternoon brought a new challenge in the form of Richard Steinberg, who arrived at her register with a cart full of expensive organic items and his usual attitude of entitled superiority. She'd been dreading this encounter since the archery tournament, knowing that he'd been present during her perfect shot and might have questions she couldn't answer. "Well, well," he said with a smirk that made Madison's skin crawl. "If it isn't our local Annie Oakley. Quite a performance yesterday at the community center." Madison kept her expression neutral as she began scanning his items, hoping that professional courtesy might discourage further conversation. But Steinberg was clearly enjoying having information that made him feel superior, a position he relished in all his interactions with people he considered beneath his social status. "Amazing how someone can be so talented at archery while being stuck in a dead-end job like this," he continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Makes you wonder what other hidden talents are going to waste in minimum-wage positions." The comment was designed to hurt, but Madison had endured far worse treatment from people with actual power over her life and death. Richard Steinberg was nothing more than a local businessman with an inflated sense of his own importance. Someone whose worst weapon was social embarrassment rather than physical violence. "Paper or plastic?" she asked politely, continuing to scan his items. "Oh, I think we're past small talk, don't you?" Steinberg leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been asking around about you, Madison Rivers. The interesting thing is, nobody seems to know much about your background. No local schools, no previous jobs in the area, no family connections. It's like you just appeared 2 years ago." Madison's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their scanning motion. Steinberg had been investigating her, which meant other people might be asking similar questions. The anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain was beginning to unravel, thread by careful thread. "Some people prefer privacy," she said carefully. "Privacy," Steinberg repeated, as if tasting the word. "Or secrecy. There's a difference, you know. Privacy is about personal preference. Secrecy is about having something to hide." Madison finished scanning his items and provided the total, hoping to end the conversation through a simple commercial transaction. But Steinberg wasn't finished. "I have friends in various businesses around town," he said as he pulled out his credit card. "People who might be interested in hiring someone with your diverse skill set." Of course, they'd want to know more about your background, your previous experience, your qualifications. The threat was subtle but clear: cooperate with his curiosity, or face increased scrutiny from multiple sources. Madison had dealt with far more sophisticated attempts at coercion, but this was different because it was happening in the middle of her carefully constructed normal life, threatening to expose the very anonymity that kept her safe. "I appreciate the interest," she said, "but I'm happy with my current position." Steinberg's smile turned cold. "Happiness is a luxury that people in your position can't always afford," he said. "Think about it, Madison. Sometimes cooperation leads to opportunities. Sometimes it just leads to peace of mind." He left with his groceries and his implicit threats, leaving Madison to process the implications of his visit. If Steinberg was investigating her background, others might be as well. The perfect bullseye had drawn exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 2 years avoiding, and now she faced the possibility that her carefully constructed civilian identity might not survive the scrutiny. The rest of her shift passed in mechanical routine, but Madison's mind was racing through contingency plans she'd hoped never to need. Exit strategies, emergency contacts, resources she could access if her current life became untenable. The preparations felt familiar in ways that reminded her why she'd wanted to leave that life behind in the first place. As she walked home through the quiet suburban streets, Madison noticed details that would have been invisible to most residents: the placement of security cameras, the sight lines from various buildings, the patterns of foot and vehicle traffic that revealed the neighborhood's rhythms and vulnerabilities. It was automatic surveillance, the kind of environmental awareness that had kept her alive in places where inattention meant death. Her apartment building was a modest, 3-story structure that housed mostly single professionals and elderly residents who valued quiet over luxury. Madison had chosen it specifically for its unremarkable appearance and the lack of curiosity among the tenants. Her own apartment was on the 2nd floor, facing the back parking lot rather than the street, with multiple exit routes and clear sightlines in all directions. Inside, the apartment was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. A small table served as both desk and dining area, with 2 chairs that had been positioned to provide clear views of both the front door and the fire escape window. The kitchenette contained only basic necessities, and the living area held a single bookshelf filled with library books and a comfortable chair positioned for reading. What the apartment didn't contain was any evidence of Madison's real background or capabilities. No photographs, no awards, no mementos from her previous life. The only personal items were the books, carefully chosen for their generic nature, and a few pieces of unremarkable clothing hanging in the bedroom closet. But hidden behind a loose baseboard in the bedroom was a waterproof container that held documents, cash, and other items that represented Madison's insurance policy against discovery. She'd never opened the container since moving to Riverside, but now she found herself kneeling beside it, her fingers tracing the edges of the concealed compartment. Inside was everything she'd need to disappear again: multiple sets of identification documents, enough cash to last several months, contact information for people who could provide transportation, safe houses, or new identities. There was also a single photograph, creased from handling, showing 5 people in military-style gear standing in front of an aircraft that officially didn't exist. Madison stared at the photograph for several minutes, remembering faces and names that belonged to a life she'd tried to leave behind. 3 of the 5 people in the image were now dead, killed in operations that had never been acknowledged by any government agency. 1 had disappeared into deep cover assignments that made civilian contact impossible. And 1 had tried to build a normal life in a small town, working as a grocery store cashier and hoping that the past would stay buried. She put the photograph away and sealed the container, but the damage was done. The perfect bullseye had cracked the wall between her past and present, and now people were asking questions that could only lead to answers she couldn't provide. Richard Steinberg's investigation was probably just the beginning. If he could discover the gaps in her public history, others with more resources and better connections could discover much more. Madison sat in her single chair, looking out at the parking lot where her neighbors lived their ordinary lives, unaware that their quiet cashier had once been someone entirely different, someone whose skills extended far beyond retail customer service, whose training had prepared her for situations that most people couldn't imagine, whose past was classified at levels that made discussion impossible. The question now was whether she could maintain her civilian identity long enough to find a way forward, or whether the exposure at the archery tournament had started a chain reaction that would force her back into a life she'd risked everything to escape. Either way, the quiet cashier that everyone had ignored was about to become someone very difficult to overlook. The manila envelope appeared under Madison's apartment door on Thursday morning, unmarked except for her name written in block letters that suggested deliberate anonymity. She discovered it while leaving for work, nearly stepping on it in the hallway's dim lighting. The envelope was thick, substantial, containing something more significant than bills or advertisements. Madison picked it up carefully, noting the weight distribution that suggested multiple documents rather than a single letter. Her fingers detected the edges of photographs through the paper, and something metallic that felt like a key or small electronic device. Every instinct told her to open it immediately, but years of training had taught her that information could be as dangerous as weapons, especially when delivered through unofficial channels. She tucked the envelope into her purse and continued to work, but its presence weighed on her mind throughout the morning. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, arriving just days after her exposure at the archery tournament and her confrontation with Richard Steinberg. Someone was making contact, and the question was whether they represented opportunity or threat. The morning shift at Grandview Grocery proceeded with unusual tension. Patricia Wolf seemed more agitated than normal, checking her watch frequently and glancing toward the front entrance, as if expecting someone specific. The corporate visit she'd mentioned had been postponed without explanation, leaving the staff prepared for scrutiny that never materialized. "Rivers," Patricia called during the mid-morning lull. "I need you to cover Register 6. Jennifer called in sick again." Register 6 was positioned near the store's customer service counter, where Patricia spent most of her time handling returns, complaints, and administrative tasks. The location would provide more opportunities for conversation, but also more exposure to Patricia's increasingly nervous energy. "Everything all right?" Madison asked as she set up the new register, genuinely curious about her manager's unusual behavior. Patricia glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing sensitive information. "We had some visitors yesterday after you left. People asking questions about employees, requesting personnel files, that sort of thing." Madison's blood chilled, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of people?" "Said they were from corporate security, investigating some kind of insurance fraud, but they didn't have the right paperwork, and they were asking specific questions about you. When I refused to cooperate, they got very insistent." The revelation confirmed Madison's worst fears. Professional investigators had tracked her to Grandview Grocery, which meant her civilian cover was compromised in ways that might be irreversible. The question was whether they represented government agencies trying to bring her back into service, private contractors working for unknown clients, or something more dangerous. "What did you tell them?" Madison asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Nothing," Patricia replied firmly. "I've been managing retail for 30 years, and I know when someone's trying to intimidate me. I told them they could come back with proper authorization or they could leave. They chose to leave, but they didn't look happy about it." Madison felt a surge of gratitude toward her manager, who had unknowingly protected her from scrutiny that could have exposed secrets far more significant than insurance fraud. Patricia's retail experience had provided instincts that proved more valuable than sophisticated security training. "I appreciate that," Madison said, meaning it more than Patricia could possibly understand. "Just be careful," Patricia warned. Something about those men felt wrong. They weren't asking questions like investigators. They were asking questions like hunters. The distinction sent another chill down Madison's spine. In her previous life, she'd been both investigator and hunter, and she knew the difference between gathering information and stalking prey. If Patricia's instincts were correct, Madison was being tracked by people whose intentions went beyond a simple information gathering. The morning continued with forced normalcy, but Madison found herself cataloging every customer, noting faces that seemed out of place or behaviors that suggested surveillance. Her training had made paranoia a survival skill, and now that paranoia was screaming warnings about multiple threats converging on her carefully constructed life. During her lunch break, Madison finally opened the manila envelope in the privacy of the park behind the grocery store. Inside were 3 items that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. The first was a photograph of herself taken the previous day at the archery tournament, but not from the crowd of spectators. This image had been captured from an elevated position with professional equipment, showing her perfect form with telephoto clarity that revealed details invisible to casual observers. Someone with significant resources had been watching, documenting, analyzing. The second item was a copy of her original employment application at Grandview Grocery, but with annotations in red ink that highlighted inconsistencies in her background information. Someone had verified her references and discovered that several of them led to disconnected phone numbers or non-existent addresses. Her carefully constructed civilian identity had been systematically dismantled by professional investigators. The third item was a brass key attached to a small tag bearing only a number, 247. Madison recognized it immediately as a key to a safe deposit box, though she had no idea which bank or what the box might contain. The key represented a mystery within a mystery, another layer of complexity in a situation that was already becoming unmanageable. Beneath these items was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. The Riverside Public Library, Local History Section, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring questions, not weapons. The message was unsigned, but the phrasing suggested someone familiar with Madison's background and capabilities. The reference to weapons implied knowledge of skills that went far beyond archery, and the library location suggested someone who valued public spaces for their security cameras and witness potential. Madison studied the photograph again, noting technical details that revealed the photographer's expertise. The image quality, angle, and timing suggested someone with access to professional surveillance equipment and the training to use it effectively. This wasn't the work of Richard Steinberg or local investigators. This was something much more sophisticated. She returned to work with her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. The envelope represented contact from someone who knew far more about her situation than she knew about theirs, which put her at a significant disadvantage. But it also represented the first direct communication since her cover had been blown, which meant answers might finally be possible. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Jake Morrison, the archery instructor from the community center. He approached her register with a small purchase and an expression that suggested purposes beyond shopping for granola bars and bottled water. "Afternoon, Madison," he said, his tone carrying the same analytical quality she'd noticed at the tournament. "How are you feeling after Tuesday's excitement?" "Fine," Madison replied, scanning his items with mechanical efficiency. "Just a lucky shot." Jake's laugh suggested he found her explanation as unconvincing as everyone else had. "I've been thinking about that lucky shot," he said. "Specifically, about the technical aspects that made it possible." Madison's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their scanning motion. "I'm not sure what you mean." The distance was 70 meters, with a 15-knot crosswind and late afternoon lighting that created significant glare, Jake explained, his instructor's knowledge evident in every detail. "Your arrow placement wasn't just accurate. It compensated for environmental factors that most archers wouldn't even notice, let alone calculate for." The analysis was uncomfortably precise, revealing Jake's understanding of the technical skills required for her shot. Madison realized that she'd underestimated his expertise, assuming that community center instructors wouldn't possess the knowledge to decode professional-level technique. "Maybe the conditions weren't as challenging as they seemed," Madison suggested weakly. "Maybe," Jake agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Or maybe you have training that you're not talking about. Training that goes beyond civilian archery programs." The probe was direct enough to require a response, but Madison couldn't provide honesty without revealing information that might put both of them in danger. She finished scanning his items and provided the total, hoping that a commercial transaction might end the conversation. "You know," Jake continued as he paid, "I spent 12 years in military special operations before I started teaching archery. I recognize certain indicators when I see them." The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. Jake Morrison wasn't just a community center instructor. He was a former military with special operations experience, which explained his ability to analyze her technique and identify inconsistencies in her cover story. It also meant he might have contacts and resources that could either help or threaten her, depending on his intentions. "That must have been interesting work," Madison said carefully, unwilling to reveal her own military connections but curious about his background. "It was," Jake replied. "Taught me to recognize excellence when I see it, regardless of the context. Also taught me that people with exceptional skills don't usually end up in minimum wage jobs unless there's a very good reason." The statement hung between them like a challenge, and Madison realized that Jake Morrison represented another variable in an increasingly complex situation. His military background made him potentially valuable as an ally, but also potentially dangerous as someone capable of investigating her past through official channels. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Madison said, which was true without being specific. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That it does. But sometimes those turns are temporary, and people end up returning to what they're really meant to do. He pocketed his receipt and headed toward the exit, but paused at the door. If you ever want to talk about archery technique or anything else, I'm usually at the range Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The invitation was clearly about more than archery instruction, and Madison found herself genuinely considering it. Jake's military background meant he might understand the complexities of transitioning from classified work to civilian life, but it also meant he might have loyalties and obligations that could complicate her situation. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but Madison's mind was occupied with the growing list of people who had taken special interest in her since the archery tournament. Richard Steinberg's investigations, Sarah Blackwood's probing questions, the mysterious visitors asking Patricia about personnel files, and now Jake Morrison's military-informed analysis of her capabilities. Each contact represented a different type of threat or opportunity, but together they painted a picture of someone whose cover was deteriorating rapidly. The quiet cashier who had successfully blended into Riverside's background for 2 years was becoming increasingly visible to people with the resources and knowledge to ask dangerous questions. As her shift ended, Madison noticed a man in a business suit reading a newspaper near the bus stop outside the grocery store. His positioning allowed clear sightlines to the store's entrance, and his newspaper hadn't turned a page in the 20 minutes she'd been observing him through the front windows. Professional surveillance was notoriously difficult to detect, but amateurs often revealed themselves through precisely this kind of static behavior. Madison left through the store's rear exit, taking a circuitous route home that included several turns and backtracking movements designed to identify anyone following her. The techniques felt familiar, like returning to a language she'd once spoken fluently but had avoided using for years. Her apartment building seemed undisturbed, but Madison noticed fresh tire tracks in the gravel parking lot that suggested a vehicle had been present during unusual hours. The tracks were wide and deep, consistent with a large sedan or SUV rather than the compact cars that most residents drove. Inside her apartment, everything appeared exactly as she'd left it, but Madison's trained instincts detected subtle signs of intrusion. A book on her table was positioned differently, rotated just enough to suggest someone had examined it. The dust pattern on her dresser showed fingerprint smudges that hadn't been there that morning. Her apartment had been searched by professionals who were skilled enough to avoid obvious detection, but not quite skilled enough to fool someone with her level of training. The realization that her private space had been violated triggered responses that Madison had thought she'd suppressed. Her heart rate increased, her breathing became more controlled, and her awareness expanded to catalog every potential weapon and escape route in the small apartment. The quiet cashier was disappearing, replaced by someone whose instincts had been honed in situations where survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute competence. Madison retrieved the waterproof container from behind the loose baseboard, relieved to find it undisturbed. The searchers had been thorough but not exhaustive, probably looking for obvious evidence of her background rather than carefully hidden emergency resources. Her insurance policy remained intact, which meant she still had options if the situation deteriorated further. She sat in her single chair, processing the day's revelations and planning for tomorrow's library meeting. The brass key felt substantial in her palm, a physical reminder that someone wanted to provide answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. But accepting those answers meant acknowledging that her civilian life was effectively over, that the quiet cashier had been exposed as a facade covering someone much more complex and potentially dangerous. Outside her window, Riverside continued its quiet suburban routine, unaware that one of its most invisible residents was sitting in judgment of her own carefully constructed existence. The perfect bullseye had been more than a demonstration of skill. It had been the first crack in a wall that was now crumbling faster than Madison could repair it. Tomorrow's meeting would either provide the information she needed to regain control of her situation, or it would complete the process of dragging her back into a life she'd risked everything to escape. Either way, the transformation was already underway, and Madison Rivers was discovering that some identities are too powerful to remain hidden forever. The photograph from the manila envelope lay on her table, showing her perfect archery form captured with professional precision. It was evidence of excellence that couldn't be explained away as luck or accident, proof that the quiet cashier possessed skills that demanded explanation. And explanations, Madison knew from bitter experience, had a way of leading to obligations that were difficult to refuse and impossible to escape. She folded the photograph carefully and placed it beside the brass key, two pieces of a puzzle that would either restore her anonymity or destroy it completely. Tomorrow would reveal which outcome awaited her, but tonight she could still pretend to be nothing more than a grocery store employee who got lucky at an archery tournament. The pretense was becoming harder to maintain with each passing hour, but Madison clung to it like a lifeline, knowing that once she fully acknowledged who she really was, there would be no going back to the quiet, invisible life she'd built in Riverside. The choice was no longer whether to reveal her true identity, but when and to whom she would make that revelation. And that choice, she realized, might no longer be entirely hers to make. The Riverside Public Library occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its Gothic architecture lending an air of scholarly gravitas to what had once been a wealthy merchant's home. Madison arrived 15 minutes early, using the time to conduct surveillance of the building and surrounding area through methods that would have seemed natural to any casual observer but were actually sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. She entered through the main doors and immediately cataloged the library's layout: 2 emergency exits, security cameras positioned at strategic intervals, multiple floors connected by both stairs, and an ancient elevator that creaked ominously even when stationary. The local history section occupied the building's former parlor, a high-ceilinged room lined with glass-fronted bookcases containing documents, photographs, and artifacts from Riverside's past. At exactly 3 p.m., Madison was examining a display of Civil War-era photographs when she became aware of another presence in the room. She turned to find a woman in her 50s, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who spent time outdoors, with graying hair pulled back in a functional ponytail and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Madison Rivers," the woman said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "Thank you for coming." Madison recognized her immediately from their brief encounter at the grocery store. Sarah Blackwood, the outdoor education coordinator who had probed about wilderness skills and left behind the marked topographical map. The revelation that Sarah was behind the manila envelope added new dimensions to their previous conversation. "Sarah Blackwood," Madison replied carefully. "I should have known." "Should you have?" Sarah asked with a slight smile. "Most people see what they expect to see. A cashier scanning groceries, an outdoor educator buying hiking supplies. We're both quite good at blending into expected roles." The comment suggested that Sarah understood more about constructed identities than her cover story implied. Madison found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about their previous encounter, recognizing techniques she'd used herself when establishing contact with potential assets. "What do you want?" Madison asked directly, unwilling to engage in further verbal sparring without understanding the stakes. Sarah moved to one of the glass display cases, ostensibly examining a collection of historical documents while ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard. "I want to offer you an opportunity to use your skills for something meaningful, instead of hiding them behind a retail uniform." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Sarah agreed. "Just like you don't know why your archery form incorporates techniques that aren't taught in civilian programs. Just like you don't know why your background check revealed a 2-year gap in your employment history that coincides with the period when several highly classified training programs were producing specialists with your exact skill set." Madison felt the familiar chill that came with exposure but forced herself to remain calm. "You seem to know a lot about employment records for someone who runs outdoor education programs." "I do more than run outdoor education programs," Sarah admitted, "though that work is legitimate and important. The at-risk youth I mentioned really do exist, and they really do need mentors with specialized skills. What I didn't mention is that some of those youth are being prepared for opportunities that go beyond traditional career paths." The implication was clear. Sarah was involved in recruitment and training for activities that weren't discussed in public forums. Madison had encountered similar programs during her previous life. Operations that identified talented individuals and prepared them for work that officially didn't exist. "I'm not interested in returning to that kind of work," Madison said firmly. "Who said anything about returning?" Sarah asked. "Maybe I'm talking about starting something new, something that serves purposes you can believe in instead of missions that were classified beyond your security clearance." The distinction was intriguing despite Madison's reluctance to engage. Her previous work had often involved following orders without fully understanding the larger context, completing missions whose ultimate purpose remained hidden from operational personnel. The idea of work that aligned with her personal values rather than institutional priorities appealed to parts of herself she'd tried to suppress. "What kind of purposes?" Madison asked, hating herself for showing interest. Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew a tablet computer, its screen displaying what appeared to be a news article. 3 weeks ago, a wilderness therapy program in Colorado lost 2 teenage participants during a supposed hiking accident. Official investigation concluded that they got lost in bad weather, but the evidence suggests something more deliberate. Madison studied the article, noting details that painted a disturbing picture. The missing teenagers had been participants in a program for at-risk youth, both with backgrounds that included minor criminal activity and family dysfunction. Their disappearance had occurred in terrain that experienced hikers knew well, under weather conditions that weren't severe enough to justify the conclusions reached by local authorities. "You think they were taken," Madison said, recognizing the signs of investigation being steered away from uncomfortable truths. "I think someone is using wilderness therapy programs to access vulnerable young people for purposes that have nothing to do with rehabilitation," Sarah replied. "And I think the people responsible have connections that make official investigation difficult." The allegation struck Madison with particular force because it represented exactly the kind of predatory behavior that motivated her to seek meaningful work outside government programs. Protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation aligned with personal values that had been compromised by missions whose moral implications remained unclear. "What does this have to do with me?" Madison asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The people responsible for those disappearances have resources, training, and connections that make them dangerous to investigate through conventional means," Sarah explained. "They operate in wilderness areas where traditional law enforcement has limited capabilities, and they've proven capable of eliminating threats to their operations." Madison began to understand the scope of what Sarah was proposing. "You want to conduct unauthorized investigation into criminal activity that official agencies can't or won't pursue." "I want to protect kids who can't protect themselves," Sarah corrected, using whatever methods proved necessary and effective. Quote, "The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another library patron, an elderly man who shuffled into the local history section with the deliberate movements of someone genuinely interested in research rather than surveillance. Both women fell silent until he selected a volume about railroad development and settled into a chair on the far side of the room. "The brass key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank," Sarah continued quietly. "Box 247 contains documentation about the Colorado disappearances, including evidence that official investigators chose not to pursue. It also contains financial information that might interest you." Madison's curiosity was piqued despite her reservations. "What kind of financial information?" "The kind that explains how someone with your background could afford to disappear completely if this situation becomes untenable," Sarah replied. "New identity documents, offshore accounts, transportation resources, everything you'd need to vanish permanently, if that becomes necessary." The offer represented both temptation and threat. Cooperation would provide resources for building a new life, but refusal might result in exposure that made those resources necessary for survival. Madison recognized the technique from her own training, offering help that created obligation while suggesting consequences for non-compliance. "And if I'm not interested in your Colorado investigation?" Madison asked. "Then you keep the key, access the resources, and disappear whenever you choose," Sarah said. "No obligations, no pursuit, no consequences. Consider it payment for the inconvenience of having your cover blown." The generosity seemed too convenient, suggesting motivations that Sarah hadn't revealed. Madison's experience had taught her that offers without apparent strings usually contained hidden hooks that became visible only after commitment was made. "What are you telling me?" Madison asked directly. Sarah's smile suggested appreciation for Madison's skepticism. "Several things, actually. But the most relevant is that you're not the only person with your background who's been approached about this work. 3 others have already agreed to participate, each with specialized skills that complement what you bring to the team." The revelation that Sarah was assembling a team changed the entire dynamic of their conversation. Madison was being recruited not for individual contractor work, but for participation in an organized operation with multiple specialists and comprehensive planning. The scope suggested resources and ambitions that went far beyond investigating isolated disappearances. "Who are the others?" Madison asked. "People whose backgrounds are similar to yours, but whose specializations are different," Sarah replied. "A communications expert who spent 6 years with NSA cyber operations. A medic who served with special forces in multiple theaters. A logistics coordinator who managed supply lines for operations that officially never happened." The team composition suggested preparation for extended operations in hostile territory, far beyond what would be required for simple investigation. Madison began to suspect that Sarah's Colorado disappearances were either more complex than presented, or served as justification for activities with broader objectives. "This sounds like military operations rather than investigation," Madison observed. "Sometimes the distinction becomes irrelevant," Sarah admitted, "when you're dealing with people who use violence to protect criminal enterprises. Investigation becomes indistinguishable from combat operations." The honesty was refreshing but also concerning. Sarah was acknowledging that her proposed work would involve lethal force against targets who might or might not represent legitimate threats. Madison's previous experience included similar gray area operations, but she'd hoped to avoid such work in her civilian life. "I need time to consider this," Madison said. "Of course," Sarah agreed, "but don't take too long. The Colorado situation is developing rapidly, and the window for effective intervention is closing. More importantly, the people investigating your background aren't going to wait indefinitely for you to make decisions about your future." The reminder of external pressure was unwelcome, but accurate. Madison's exposure at the archery tournament had initiated a chain of events that was moving beyond her control, regardless of her preferences about future employment. Sarah's offer represented one possible resolution, but accepting it would mean abandoning any hope of returning to anonymous civilian life. "How long do I have?" Madison asked. 72 hours, Sarah replied. "After that, the team deploys with or without you, and your window for joining closes permanently." Quote. Madison nodded, understanding that the timeline was designed to prevent extensive deliberation that might lead to refusal. 3 days was enough time to access the safe deposit box and evaluate the offered resources, but not enough time to develop alternative plans or seek outside advice. "One more question," Madison said as Sarah prepared to leave. "How did you find me?" Sarah's expression became unreadable. "The same way others are going to find you unless you take steps to prevent it. Your archery demonstration created ripples that are spreading through communities, with long memories and extensive resources. Some of those communities want to recruit you. Others want to eliminate you as a potential threat." The warning was delivered with matter-of-fact precision that made its implications more frightening than dramatic threats would have been. Madison realized that her situation was more precarious than she'd understood, with multiple parties taking interest in her capabilities for reasons that might not align with her survival. "The safe deposit box contains more detailed information about the current threats to your security," Sarah continued, "including photographs and background information about the people who've been investigating you, knowledge that might prove useful regardless of your decision about Colorado." Sarah left without further conversation, moving through the library with the unremarkable efficiency of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. Madison remained in the local history section for another 20 minutes, ostensibly studying documents about Riverside's founding, while actually processing the implications of their conversation. The offer represented everything she'd hoped to avoid: return to classified work, participation in operations with uncertain legal status, association with people whose loyalties remained unclear. But it also represented the only apparent solution to threats that were converging on her civilian identity with increasing intensity. Madison left the library through a different exit than she'd used to enter, taking a route that allowed surveillance of anyone who might be following her. The techniques felt increasingly natural, as if 2 years of deliberate civilian behavior were being stripped away to reveal training that had never actually been suppressed. First National Bank was located in Riverside's modest downtown area, a 3-story brick building that projected the kind of conservative stability that small-town financial institutions cultivated. Madison entered during the afternoon rush, when legitimate customers provided cover for activities that might otherwise draw attention. The safe deposit box area was located in the building's basement, behind security doors that required both key and signature verification. Madison provided identification that matched her current civilian identity, signed the access log with her legal name, and was escorted to box 247 by a bank employee who seemed more interested in returning to upstairs duties than monitoring her activities. The box contained exactly what Sarah had promised: detailed documentation about the Colorado disappearances, financial information about offshore accounts established in Madison's current identity, and background files on the people who had been investigating her since the archery tournament. The Colorado files painted a disturbing picture of systematic predation disguised as wilderness therapy. Multiple programs across several states had reported unusual disappearances, always involving teenagers with criminal backgrounds or family dysfunction, that made their absence less likely to generate intensive investigation. Physical evidence suggested coordination between programs, as if missing individuals were being transferred between facilities rather than simply vanishing. The financial documents revealed resources that would allow Madison to disappear completely, accounts containing enough money to support a modest lifestyle for several years, along with contact information for services that could provide new identity documents, transportation, and relocation assistance. Sarah's offer of freedom was genuine, backed by substantial resources. But the background files on Madison's investigators were what truly captured her attention. Richard Steinberg's curiosity was revealed as a front for much more serious interest from people with connections to defense contractors and private military companies. The mysterious visitors to Grandview Grocery were identified as employees of a firm that specialized in tracking former government personnel for purposes that weren't specified in their corporate documentation. Most concerning was evidence that Jake Morrison's interest wasn't casual professional curiosity. His military background included assignments with units that specialized in asset recovery, and his current employment at the community center appeared to be cover for activities related to identifying and monitoring former special operations personnel in civilian settings. Madison realized that her situation was far more complex than personal choice about future employment. Multiple organizations were tracking her for reasons that extended beyond recruitment, suggesting that her previous work had created enemies or obligations that were only now becoming apparent. She photographed the most important documents with her phone, returned the originals to the safe deposit box, and left the bank with the understanding that her 72-hour deadline was more than administrative convenience. It was the window during which she could make voluntary decisions about her future, before those decisions were made for her by people whose intentions were unknown, but probably not aligned with her survival. The walk back to her apartment took her through Riverside's quiet residential neighborhoods, where families were beginning their evening routines behind lighted windows that revealed glimpses of normal life. Madison found herself studying those windows with new appreciation for their tranquility, recognizing that she might never again experience the simple peace of anonymity and routine that most people took for granted. Her apartment building looked the same as always, but Madison now approached it with the heightened awareness of someone who understood that safety was an illusion maintained through constant vigilance rather than environmental security. The brass key felt substantial in her pocket, a physical reminder that her choices had been reduced to variations of the same theme: return to classified work under different management, or disappear completely and hope that interested parties would accept her retirement. The quiet cashier, who had successfully hidden among Riverside's invisible service workers for 2 years, was about to make decisions that would determine whether Madison Rivers continued to exist, or whether she joined the ranks of people whose identities were as carefully constructed as their previous lives had been systematically erased. Either way, the transformation was already underway, and the only question remaining was whether Madison would control the process or become its victim. The decision came at 4:17 a.m. on Saturday morning, not through careful deliberation, but through the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside Madison's apartment. 3 sets of boots moving with tactical precision, pausing at intervals that suggested room-by-room clearing procedures. Professional operators conducted a building sweep, and Madison was their target. She rolled silently from her bed, muscle memory taking over as her mind cataloged available resources and escape routes. The waterproof container behind the baseboard would have to be abandoned. There wasn't time to retrieve it without exposing herself to the hallway. The fire escape window offered the only viable exit, but reaching it would require crossing the apartment's main room where she'd be visible to anyone entering through the front door. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door, followed by the subtle sounds of lock manipulation. Professional entry tools, probably electronic, designed for silent access that wouldn't alert neighboring residents. Madison had perhaps 30 seconds before her apartment was compromised. She moved to the bedroom window, easing it open with practiced silence, while her ears tracked the progress of the entry team. The fire escape's metal grating would announce her presence to anyone listening, but staying in the apartment meant capture or worse. The choice was between certain exposure and probable death. Madison climbed through the window just as she heard her front door open with a barely audible click. She descended the fire escape with controlled speed, testing each step for structural integrity while moving fast enough to stay ahead of the team that would soon discover her absence. The building's rear parking lot was empty except for her neighbor's ancient Honda and a panel van that definitely hadn't been there the previous evening. The van's engine started as soon as Madison's feet touched the ground, confirming that the building entry was part of a coordinated operation. Professional asset recovery, designed to capture rather than eliminate, which meant her value as a living person exceeded her threat as a potential security breach. Madison sprinted toward the tree line that bordered the apartment complex, using residential landscaping as concealment while putting distance between herself and the capture team. Behind her, she heard voices through open windows as the operators discovered her escape, followed by radio communications that suggested significant resources dedicated to her recovery. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the search expanded beyond the building, 10 minutes before additional units arrived to establish a perimeter. Madison's civilian identity was completely compromised, but her training remained intact, and that training was about to determine whether she survived the next hour. The Riverside Community Center was dark and apparently empty when Madison arrived 20 minutes later, having covered 3 miles through backyards, drainage ditches, and wooded areas that provided concealment from vehicle-based search patterns. Her approach to the building utilized techniques she hadn't practiced in 2 years, but muscle memory proved reliable under pressure. Jake Morrison's pickup truck was parked behind the archery range building, exactly where Sarah Blackwood had said it would be in the contingency instructions contained within the safe deposit box files. Madison had hoped never to need those instructions, but someone had anticipated that her situation might deteriorate rapidly. The range building's rear door was unlocked, opening to reveal Jake Morrison standing beside an equipment table that held items no community center instructor should have possessed: tactical communications gear, night vision devices, weapons that were definitely not sporting goods, and clothing that suggested preparation for extended field operations. "You're early," Jake said, checking his watch. "Sarah said you had until tomorrow evening to make your decision." "The decision was made for me," Madison replied, still breathing hard from her escape and sprint across town. "The asset recovery team hit my apartment about 20 minutes ago." Jake's expression shifted from mild concern to professional alertness. "How many?" 3 for building entry plus vehicle support. Professional operation, probably defense contractor rather than government agency. "Steinberg Development has connections with Blackwater alumni," Jake observed. "Richard Steinberg's been making calls to people who specialize in acquiring human resources that traditional employment agencies can't provide." The revelation that Steinberg's investigation had escalated to contracted mercenary operations confirmed Madison's worst fears about exposure. Her archery demonstration had drawn attention from people whose interest went far beyond curiosity about hidden talents. "How long have you been working with Sarah?" Madison asked, studying the equipment that revealed Jake's true affiliations. 18 months, Jake replied. "Ever since she approached me about using my military background for work that actually makes a difference. Turns out there are a lot of former special operations personnel who got tired of missions that served corporate interests rather than human welfare." Madison recognized the sentiment from her own experience with classified operations, whose ultimate purposes remained obscure to operational personnel. Sarah's recruitment strategy apparently focused on people whose disillusionment with government service made them receptive to alternative applications of their skills. "Where is she now?" Madison asked. "Colorado, with the advance team," Jake replied, "investigating the wilderness therapy programs we discussed. She was hoping you'd have time to make a voluntary decision about participation, but circumstances seem to have accelerated the timeline." Jake activated one of the communication devices, establishing contact with Sarah's team through encrypted channels that suggested access to military-grade equipment. The conversation was brief but illuminating. Madison's escape had been detected by the asset recovery team, who were now expanding their search throughout Riverside while requesting additional resources from their corporate employers. "How much time do we have?" Madison asked, after Jake completed the communication. "About 2 hours before they establish a perimeter that makes extraction impossible," Jake replied. "Sarah's sending a helicopter to collect us from the high school football field. After that, you're committed to Colorado, whether you've decided to join the team or not." The timeline meant that Madison's choices had been reduced to immediate action or capture by people whose intentions were unknown but probably not aligned with her welfare. The quiet cashier who had spent 2 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation was about to discover whether her training remained adequate for operations that officially didn't exist. "What's the real story about Colorado?" Madison asked as she began examining the tactical equipment Jake had assembled. "Worse than Sarah told you," Jake admitted. "The missing teenagers aren't just disappearing, they're being sold to people who use them for activities that would make asset recovery seem benevolent by comparison. We're talking about human trafficking disguised as wilderness therapy, with connections to international networks that specialize in acquiring young people with specific vulnerabilities." The revelation struck Madison with personal force because it represented exactly the kind of predatory exploitation that had motivated her to seek meaningful work outside government programs. Protecting vulnerable individuals from systematic abuse aligned with values that had been compromised by missions whose moral implications remained unclear. "How many kids are we talking about?" Madison asked. "At least 37 confirmed disappearances over the past 18 months, Jake replied. "Probably more that haven't been reported or investigated. The programs target teenagers whose absence won't generate intensive law enforcement attention. Runaways, minor criminals, kids from dysfunctional families who won't be missed immediately." Madison felt the familiar surge of purpose that had once motivated her best work, the recognition of a mission that justified risks to personal safety. The quiet cashier had spent 2 years avoiding meaningful engagement with the world's problems, but circumstances were forcing her to choose between continued hiding and active intervention. "What does Sarah's team need from me?" Madison asked, accepting that her civilian life was effectively over regardless of her participation in Colorado operations. "Long-range precision shooting," Jake replied without hesitation. "The trafficking network uses wilderness areas that are accessible only on foot, with sightlines that favor defenders over attackers. Traditional law enforcement can't operate effectively in that terrain, but someone with your marksmanship skills could neutralize threats from distances that ensure tactical advantage." The mission profile was exactly what Madison's training had prepared her for: precision operations in challenging terrain against targets who wouldn't hesitate to use lethal force. The work would be dangerous but aligned with objectives she could support without moral compromise. "What about extraction afterward?" Madison asked, recognizing that successful completion of Colorado operations might not guarantee return to civilian life. "That depends on what we discover about the trafficking network," Jake admitted. "If it's limited to wilderness therapy programs, we complete the mission and everyone goes home. If it connects to larger criminal enterprises, we might find ourselves with ongoing obligations." The honesty was appreciated but concerning. Madison was being asked to commit to operations whose scope might expand beyond current intelligence, potentially trapping her in exactly the kind of classified work she'd tried to escape. But the alternative was captured by asset recovery teams whose intentions were unknown but probably not focused on her welfare. Richard Steinberg's investigation had escalated to contracted mercenary operations, suggesting that her value as a potential asset exceeded her threat as a security risk. "I'm in," Madison said, surprising herself with the speed of her decision. "Not because I want to return to this kind of work, but because some things are too important to ignore." Jake nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly predicted her choice. "Sarah said you'd make the right decision once you understood the stakes. People with your background usually do, eventually." The next 90 minutes passed in preparation that felt familiar despite 2 years of civilian routine. Madison changed into tactical clothing that fit better than her grocery store uniform, checked weapons that felt natural in her hands despite her attempts to forget their operation, and reviewed mission files that painted a comprehensive picture of their Colorado objectives. The trafficking network was more sophisticated than she'd initially understood, involving multiple wilderness therapy programs across several states, with coordination that suggested significant resources and professional planning. The missing teenagers weren't random victims, but carefully selected targets whose specific vulnerabilities made them valuable to buyers with particular requirements. Sarah's team had spent months developing intelligence about the network's operations, identifying key personnel and facility locations, while building legal cases that could result in prosecutions if evidence could be obtained through methods that wouldn't be excluded from court proceedings. The mission was law enforcement rather than military action, but the distinction was academic when dealing with criminals who possessed military-grade weapons and training. The helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, landing on the high school football field with a kind of precision that suggested experienced pilots accustomed to tactical insertions. Madison recognized the aircraft as civilian-marked but military-configured, designed for operations that required official deniability while maintaining tactical capability. As Riverside disappeared beneath them, Madison found herself processing the transformation of the past week. The quiet cashier who had scanned groceries and avoided meaningful engagement with the world's problems was being replaced by someone whose skills could make actual difference in situations where traditional authorities were inadequate or unwilling to act. The perfect bullseye at the archery tournament hadn't just demonstrated hidden marksmanship, it had been the catalyst for returning to work that aligned with her deepest values, rather than institutional priorities she couldn't influence or understand. Sarah's recruitment had offered what Madison's previous service had never provided: missions whose purposes were clear and whose outcomes would directly benefit people who needed protection. Colorado represented unknown dangers but known objectives. The trafficking network would be dismantled through whatever methods proved necessary, the missing teenagers would be recovered if possible, and the people responsible would face consequences that traditional law enforcement couldn't impose. Madison's marksmanship skills would serve purposes she could believe in, rather than classified agendas that remained beyond her security clearance. As the helicopter carried her toward operations that would test every aspect of her training, Madison realized that the quiet cashier had been a necessary phase rather than a permanent identity. 2 years of civilian life had provided perspective on the value of work that served human welfare rather than institutional interests, but they had also demonstrated that some problems required specialized solutions that only people with her background could provide. The transformation was complete. Madison Rivers would continue to exist in official documents and financial records, but the person who had hidden behind that identity was emerging as someone capable of actions that would have been impossible for a grocery store cashier. The perfect shot that had shattered her anonymity had also restored her sense of purpose, revealing that some skills are too valuable to remain hidden when people's lives depend on their application. Below them, the lights of small towns gave way to wilderness areas where vulnerable young people were being exploited by criminals who believed their isolation provided protection from consequences. Sarah's team was about to demonstrate that isolation worked both ways, and that people with Madison's capabilities could operate in terrain that favored precision over numbers, skill over resources, and determination over institutional authority. The quiet cashier, who had been ignored and underestimated, was about to remind the world that extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for circumstances that justify revealing who they really are. Sometimes those circumstances come through choice, and sometimes they come through necessity. For Madison Rivers, they had come through a perfect bullseye that changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.